while he's doing that. So I like the title of the conference, The Return of Full Employment. It's certainly hopeful thinking. I hope it's not wishful thinking. Jamie and I remember right after the crisis hit, we were on a panel together, and we were talking about the end of mainstream theory. And we were very hopeful that Keynes had returned, and Robert Skidelsky, the biographer of Keynes, wrote a book called The Return of the Master, and I think we were all hopefully thinking that there would be a turn to progressive economics based on Keynes's theory. It turned out maybe it was wishful thinking. We did not actually return to it yet. I am still hopeful that someday will be the right time for turning back to questions of full employment and what does full employment mean and how do we get to full employment. So I'm like Jamie, I am going to return to the American experience mostly because in my case, because I know it, not so much because I'm going to be making the an argument similar to Jamie's that our experience is one that we ought to emulate, because the story I'm going to tell is it didn't have quite so happy of an ending. When the crisis hit, my professor, Hyman Minsky, who was relatively obscure, especially in Europe, maybe a little less obscure in America, was cited in virtually every explanation of the crisis. It was called the Minsky moment or the Minsky crisis. Minsky is very well known for his work on financial instability, and the crisis validated, after his death, the theory that he'd been developing for 50 years. Bill Gross, who you may know runs the biggest bond firm in the world, in 2011 wrote this nice little piece where he returned to Hyman Minsky, but for something completely different. Here we were in a recovery that was mostly a jobless recovery in the United States, and he said, let's look back to Minsky. Big government should become the employer of last resort. Now, Bill Gross says in a crisis, as I'll explain, this was not a crisis response, this is a permanent program for Minsky. And then he goes on to mention some of the New Deal programs that Jamie already talked about. And finally, I'd have a shovel in the hands of the long-term unemployed. Okay, this is the solution to the unemployment problem. So Hyman Minsky. After Minsky's death, I went back and looked at the writings of Minsky that I didn't know and that really virtually nobody knew back in 1996. Minsky wrote almost as much on poverty, unemployment, and employment policy as he had on financial instability. He came out of graduate school in the late 50s, and when he moved on to University of California at Berkeley, there was a center there that was studying the poverty and unemployment problem. And they posed an alternative to the war on poverty that we actually got. So what I'm going to do is summarize this early writing from Minsky, this different approach, the approach the US did not take to solving our unemployment and poverty problem, okay? So here, these are the 3 points I want to leave you with about Minsky's own work. First, a true war on poverty must include a commitment to full employment. You can't really resolve the poverty problem without a jobs program. Second, responsibility for full employment must fall to the state. And the reason, of course, is that the private sector is a for-profit sector. It creates jobs only so as to generate profit. They are not in the charity business. They're not in the job supply business. They are in the for-profit business. So full employment is not their goal. Only the state can ensure full employment. And finally, the state as the sovereign currency issuer has the financial capacity to meet that responsibility. So this resolves the affordability question. Okay, sure, we might agree that the state has the responsibility, but does it have the financial capacity? Minsky's answer, yes, it does. As the sovereign currency issuer, it has the capacity. So the approach that I'm going to be presenting follows these early writings of Minsky. And just to show you, there are a lot of publications. This is just a partial list of the things that he wrote. A lot of these things were forgotten. Many of them were not published. At the Levy Institute, we're trying to put this old unpublished work out there. There will be a new book authored, in a sense, by Minsky. It will only contain his own words on this topic very soon. Now, what we actually got was President Johnson's approach. Although the war on poverty began, in a sense, under President Kennedy, it was President Johnson who formulated the program that we adopted in the U.S. He declared an unconditional war on poverty, and the key component of that was the Equal Opportunity Act, tax cuts to spur economic growth, although we always call this the age of Keynes, and we think that it was mostly government spending. Actually, if you look at both Kennedy and Johnson, they relied to a great extent on tax cuts to stimulate the economy, which you normally associate with supply-side economics. The war on poverty was to rehabilitate and train the poor for the jobs that, number one, the tax cuts was expected to generate, and then finally the programs that Jamie talked about, Medicare and Medicaid, together with beefing up food stamps and welfare-type programs, were supposed to resolve the remaining poverty that the first and second policies did not resolve. However, by the 1970s, as Jamie already referred to, we already started to move, so less than 10 years later, we're already moving away from this approach to poverty. Conservatives are blaming these social programs created to resolve the poverty problem for creating poverty by inducing people to be lazy, discouraging work. Okay, then we got the Ronald Reagan revolution, as Jamie said, where we have this popular belief. Reagan used to say, well, the welfare queens, the welfare moms drive Cadillacs, things like this. It was a disguised racial propaganda, basically, to believe that poor people are poor by choice, and really they're not that poor, they're driving Cadillacs. And then finally we got President Clinton, who said we're going to end welfare as we know it. We're going to have lifetime limits of 5 years on welfare, and we're going to focus more on, well, teaching people how to swim rather than providing a social safety net. Okay, the question is, was the war on poverty successful? I've already implicated that its lifespan was pretty short, but from the very beginning, it really did not resolve the war on poverty. Whoops. The answer was no. The unemployment rates have trended upward. Long-term unemployment became increasingly concentrated in the disadvantaged. Poverty rates today are the highest they've been since 1959. Real wages for most workers have declined. The inequality has grown. In the short term, that 10-year period, it did look like the war on poverty was successful in that poverty rates did decline between the time of the implementation and the start of the Nixon recession. My colleague and I, Stephanie Kelton, have looked at the data in detail, and we find that actually those poverty rate numbers are highly misleading because they're including the elderly. Only the elderly had significant improvements of poverty rates that are attributable to public policy, especially the policy adopted during the 1960s. There was some decline in poverty among blacks, but that had more to do with moving out of the South into the North. Okay, so the anti-discrimination policies certainly had an impact on poverty for black Americans, but it really was not the war on poverty that reduced their poverty rates. It really was Social Security. Social Security is the best anti-poverty program the U.S. has had. It has greatly reduced poverty among seniors. But other than that, the war on poverty did not reduce poverty rates. In every year for the past 50 years, at least 11% of the U.S. population has been below the official poverty line, which is certainly set far too low and increasingly unrealistic as a measure of what is actual poverty in the United States. 2010, it was 15%, 46 million poor people, the highest since estimates began. You would have to say this unconditional war on poverty did not succeed if the number of people living in poverty is continuing to rise. It's becoming concentrated among families with children, and especially female-headed households. And then millions more live in near poverty. I'll present just a little bit of data, and then we'll get beyond the United States experience. The U.S. has the highest inequality rate in the industrialized world, and we've had the most rapid rise of inequality in the last 2 decades that the U.S. has seen. I have read some scary things about Finland, too, with rapidly rising inequality more rapidly than among other European industrialized nations. The top 1% now has 70% of all financial assets. From 1980 to 2006, the richest 1% of Americans tripled their after-tax income, while the bottom 90% lost 20% of their income. CEOs earned $25 for every $1 back in 1970 for the average worker. Today it's $500 for every dollar. These are the results, and actually they should have been the predicted results of moving to supply-side economics and relying more on markets, because wealth and income don't trickle down. Wealth is more like cream, it rises to the top. If you don't have the proper institutions, and including institutions that Jamie is talking about, to constrain this, all wealth will go to the top, and that is what is happening in the United States. Key omissions in the war on poverty. Minsky wrote in 1965, "The war on poverty will fail without direct job creation through an employer of last resort program. It will fail because it does not have a significant job creation program. It has training. It is going to train the unemployed for jobs that will not exist." That's the fundamental problem. And although Johnson's task force actually pleaded with him to do so, Johnson refused to make direct job creation a part of the war on poverty. That resulted from his economic advisor's belief that, first, poverty is not inextricably linked to unemployment. We can solve the poverty problem with welfare and training. Okay, it's not an employment problem. Second, unemployment could be sufficiently reduced through aggregate demand policies, such as the tax cut. And finally, you need a buffer stock of unemployed. So here is the NIRU, the employment inflation trade-off. We need the unemployed. So actually, unemployment is not a problem to solve. It is a tool to be used by policymakers to fight inflation. Okay, so that was an additional part of their belief. And of course, that belief came to really dominate all public policy throughout the world. We need the pool of unemployed, and that is why we have lost the commitment that most developed nations used to have to full employment. Minsky's argument was we were relying too much on what has come to be called by conservatives entitlements rather than social safety net, rather than jobs. And this table here just shows the total transfers as a percent of GDP. Early post-war, 7.6%. By 1979, it had grown to 17%. Now, it's true, a lot of this reflects Social Security, not targeted welfare programs to the poor. But Minsky's argument was that this was a perversion of the vision of the New Deal, which had a huge job creation component. Jamie mentioned the job creation programs. They employed 13 million people. Okay? The WPA alone employed 8 million people. These were huge relative to the size of the labor force. Minsky, in I believe 1974, calculated that if we provided just one minimum wage job per poor family, we would cut the poverty rate by 2/3. That's one minimum wage job. And the U.S. minimum wage has always been very low. It's even lower today relative to average wages. But just one job would do this. So Stephanie Kelton and I recalculated around 2000, and even with a relatively even lower minimum wage in the year 2000, the result was still the same. It would eliminate 2/3 of all poverty if we could just get one job per family. Causes of unemployment. Of course, right now, we have tremendous unemployment in most countries in the world due to the economic downturn. And so over the course of the business cycle, of course, unemployment goes up in a downturn. Okay? But on top of that, we have long-run trend rising unemployment almost everywhere. China is a glowing exception to this due to demand caps, structural unemployment, which was already mentioned, and due to what the ILO called in a major report that came out in 2007, note the date, before the crisis, 2007, they said, although we've had relatively robust economic growth all over the globe by 2007, it's not creating jobs. So we can get growth without creating many jobs, and that's because of the increased productivity of labor, in large part due to the increased productivity of the plant and machines that labor is using. So my point here is that Bill Gross got it wrong. You don't need a job creation program just in crisis. You need a permanent jobs program to deal with this problem that in the past and increasingly in the future, we're going to have jobless growth. We're going to have the private sector growing, creating output, but not creating sufficient jobs to keep pace with the growth of the labor force. So the jobs program has to be permanent. Here, since I presume most people here are not orthodox economists, what I'm going to say here is not surprising to you, but in economics, we don't talk about things like this normally. The costs of unemployment go way beyond the lost wages to the worker and the lost output to society as a whole. There are huge social costs, which no doubt are much bigger than the costs of not producing something and not paying somebody wages. Poverty, social isolation, crime, regional deterioration because unemployment is usually regionally concentrated, health issues, family breakdown, school dropouts, social, political, and economic instability. It promotes violence, ethnic hostility, racial hostility in the U.S., even terrorism, loss of human capital, and long-term unemployed become first structurally unemployable and then just plain unemployable. The experience of long-term unemployment is devastating. Again, a bit of data. A lot of this comes from the U.S., but not all of it. The death rate increases 50 to 100% following job loss for a male worker. They live 1.5 years less than a worker who keeps his job. Unemployed men face a 25% higher risk of dying of cancer. 18% increase in probability of divorce following a husband's job loss. 13% for the wife. Children whose fathers lose a job have reduced earnings as adults. We're talking about very long-term effects of an experience of unemployment. They have about 9% lower annual earning than children whose fathers do not experience unemployment. And then finally, a major work by epidemiologists argued that the data are very clear across societies on these points. More equal societies almost always do better. 5 sets of data they present illustrate that whether you classify people by education, social class, or income, people are healthier if they're in a more equal society than people in the same category of income, in education, or class in a less equal society. Inequality damages social relationships. Measures of trust and social cohesion are higher, and violence is lower in more equal societies. And finally, let me just leave you with this picture showing the correlation of unemployment and suicide in Japan. Now, suicide is somewhat related to culture, but we have a similar correlation in the United States with suicide rising. I know Jamie's father said that the stories about the traders jumping out the windows when the stock market crashed are vastly overstated, but unemployment is bad for suicide. Benefits of full employment, again, goes way beyond the production of goods and services. It includes on-the-job training and skill development, poverty alleviation, community building, social networking, intergenerational stability, social, political, and economic stability. And then there's this idea of social multipliers. The positive feedbacks and reinforcing dynamics create a virtuous cycle of socioeconomic benefits. The total impact exceeds the sum of the individual benefits, and this is the work of Nobel winner Sen. Okay, unemployment. We've got an unemployment problem in the United States. We have about 25 million people who want full-time jobs and cannot get them. Now, some of these people are working part-time involuntarily. Some of them are counted as unemployed. Some are not counted as unemployed because they've given up all hope of ever getting a job. So, but that total is 25 million. What do we do about it? President Obama, the government's run out of money. So there's nothing that we can do about this except hope that the private sector will create these jobs. We're on an unsustainable debt path, and look at what's going on in Euroland. We don't want that to happen to the United States, so we need to get our debt and deficits under control in order to satisfy the bond vigilantes who might do to us what they've done to Greece, okay? Well, this is completely wrong. The U.S. is not Greece. The U.S. cannot be forced into an involuntary default on any commitment that it has made. And many people say, well, yes, that's true of the U.S. because you're the international reserve currency issuer. No, these statements are true for any country that issues its own currency. Now, I will come back in a few minutes to the Euroland nations because you have given up currency sovereignty to some degree. Now, when I say something like that, the U.S. cannot be forced to default, it cannot be forced into insolvency, people say, well, you know, that seems fairly radical, maybe even crazy. But I can find you as many quotes as you want from absolutely mainstream economists and from mainstream policymakers like Greenspan, who was asked point blank, can the U.S. Social Security program ever become insolvent? And he said, no, it cannot. The government issues the currency. It cannot become insolvent. Here's the St. Louis Fed, which is the home of monetarism in the United States. As the sole manufacturer of dollars whose debt is denominated in dollars, the U.S. government can never become insolvent, i.e. unable to pay its bills. In this sense, the government is not dependent on credit markets to remain operational. Moreover, there will always be a market for U.S. government debt at home, because the U.S. government has the only means of creating risk-free dollar-denominated assets. So let me translate this to plain English. Sovereign government can never run out of dollars. It can never be forced to default. It can never be forced to miss a payment. It is never subject to the whims of bond vigilantes, period. Okay. And this is true of any country that meets the qualifications here, issues its own currency, issues debt denominated in its own currency. It cannot become insolvent. So what is the correct paradigm to look at a nation like this? It has come to be called modern money theory, MMT, okay? A name that was pegged on us, not one we necessarily would have chosen. But anyway, now that it's all over the blogosphere, we don't have any choice in this matter, okay? So modern money theory. It applies to a country that has a government-issued sovereign currency. And if that country takes the step of floating its exchange rate, then it will have the maximum amount of policy space. Now, many countries that issue their own currency do not choose to float. Okay, they might try a managed exchange rate system, which is very common, maybe the most common. That is, they try to keep it in a range, but if push comes to shove, they let it move outside the range. Or they might try to peg the exchange rate. Now, to the extent that you try to manage or peg, you will reduce your domestic policy space because you will implement domestic policy with a view to keeping your exchange rate where you want it to be. Okay, so floating allows you more domestic policy space because you pay less attention to the exchange rate. Okay, but even if you do manage your exchange rate, if you issue your own currency, you are still sovereign in the sense that I'm using this term. Okay, although it can be a little more dangerous and constraining if you choose not to float. In this sort of arrangement, the sovereign currency arrangement, the way that a government really spends is by crediting bank reserves. Now, a lot of people refer to printing money, but the U.S. government doesn't actually sit down in the basement and run a printing press when it wants to spend, okay? The Treasury never spends that way, in fact, in the United States. The way that they spend is they tell their bank, which we call the Fed, that's the Treasury's bank, they tell their bank to credit bank reserves. That's how they spend. And then the bank that gets a credit of reserves credits the deposit account of the recipient of the government spending. This is how they spend. This is not a policy recommendation, it's a description, a plain old description of how it is actually done. The central bank then sets the overnight interest rate target. Okay, this is not controversial anymore at all. We went through a period that was called monetarism, where central banks supposedly targeted the money supply, something they cannot do, cannot hit, and now admit it, that it was all a delusion, it was a Friedmanian delusion. They all now target the overnight interest rate. Plain and simple, that's what they do. What that means is that they have to add or drain reserves from the banking system in order to hit their overnight target. Okay? So the quantity of reserves in the system is not a discretionary variable. When the government is spending more, crediting more reserves than it is taxing, debiting bank reserves, banks end up with excess reserves in the banking system. The central bank has no choice except to drain any undesired excess reserves from the banking system. Otherwise, it won't be able to hit its overnight interest rate target. Okay, now, I realize most of you here don't want to go into all of the details of these operating procedures. Okay, so if anyone wants to read more or to talk to me about this afterwards, I'll be glad to explain how this works. Okay, and it functions extremely smoothly. And the Treasury and the central bank understand what they're doing. How do I know that? Because they hit their target. Hitting their target is evidence that what the description I'm giving you is correct, okay, and that they understand what to do. Now, on the other hand, the money that is created by banks is, in our heterodox economics terminology, endogenous. Okay. Banks create money when they see a good borrower, or when you're in a mass speculative delusional boom like we were in the United States from 2000 to 2006. They create money when they see unworthy borrowers. Okay, so it's a private decision, and it can be supervised and somewhat controlled if you choose to do so. Now, most countries adopt self-imposed constraints on the government's ability to spend. Okay? And it makes sense to do so. We all want a budgeting process. The budgeting process constrains the government's spending. And that is a good thing. Okay? First, runaway government spending can be inflationary. Second, the government might get involved in all sorts of areas you don't want the government involved in. Third, the government can potentially remove all resources so that the private sector can't use them. So there are very good reasons for budgeting, okay? But in addition to that, we sometimes impose constraints that really make no sense. In the United States, we have a debt limit, self-imposed by Congress, which we run up to every few years. We hit the debt limit. And then we have to have a stupid political debate between Republicans and Democrats about raising the debt limit, okay? And we went through one, and that's how we got the fiscal cliff, okay? You all know that. Balanced budgets. Okay, again, this is a silly limit. First, because it's sort of like targeting the money supply. The government actually does not have the capacity to hit a balanced budget requirement because, to a great extent, the budgetary outcome is not discretionary. It depends on the performance of the economy. So you can legislate it all you want. You must balance the budget. But the national government will only be able to balance this budget if that is consistent with the other sector's balances, okay, as Jamie briefly mentioned. If the non-government sector is going to run a surplus, the government is going to run a deficit. To the extent that households and firms have any discretion at all in their own balances, it means the government does not have discretion in its balance. Okay? So if we believe that consumers and firms have any discretion in what they do, and I think we all believe that, then we must believe the government doesn't have discretion in its budgetary outcome, by definition. Okay? Two sides of the same coin. Finally, other things like fixed exchange rates, I already discussed. You can impose that on yourself if you want, but it will limit your domestic policy space. The belief that the market determines the interest rate on sovereign government debt can be constraining. There are countries that I speak in Mexico where the central bank believes the market determines the overnight interest rate on pesos. Okay, this is crazy. The central bank determines. So you get the central bank chasing the market, okay? In any case, the real constraint that faces the government is not a financial constraint. Okay? It's a full employment constraint. Once you get to full employment of resources, if the government tries to spend beyond that, okay, it can only succeed in actually capturing more resources by taking them away from the private sector. We're going to get a bidding war, and we're going to end up with inflation. So really, that is the constraint on the government's spending, and this is the idea of functional finance. Okay, balancing the budget over a period determined by the movement of the sun or the stars, okay, is like astrology. Okay, it's a myth. There's no need to do that. A proper goal of policy would be full employment and relative price stability. I tell you what, the only point I want to make here, I've already talked about spending leads to credit bank accounts, taxes leads to debits. When the government is deficit spending, it is net crediting balance sheets. And that leads to net reserve add to the banking system. The central bank wants to hit its overnight interest rate target. That means it's going to have to drain the reserves. And it does this through an open market sale. Central banks in normal times have a limited quantity of government bonds on their balance sheet that they can sell in order to drain excess reserves. Now, with quantitative easing, we've removed that limit because the Fed is sitting there with about $1.5 trillion of government bonds. It can engage in open market sales until the cows come home now. But in normal times, it does not have many. So what happens is that every morning, the Fed and Treasury coordinate their operations, and the Fed says, hey, we believe that the banks are going to end with a net excess reserve position. We need you to sell some bonds into the banking system. So the Treasury will sell bonds to relieve the pressure on the Fed to sell bonds to drain the excess reserves. The recognition that there is no difference between an open market sale by the Fed or a new issue sale of treasuries by the Treasury have the same impact on the banking system was the original insight of this trader named Warren Mosler, who together with a bunch of academics developed this modern money theory approach. He's sitting there looking at financial markets and he said, hold it. The operational impact of an open market sale and a treasury sale is exactly the same. So they must be part of monetary policy. Sale of government bonds by the sovereign is part of monetary policy. It's not a borrowing operation. It is not for the government to get more of its own money so that it can spend. The government is the issuer of the money and therefore doesn't need to borrow. You can think of money as scorekeeping, and I think this is a better way of thinking about it than thinking of printing presses. Okay, maybe you don't recognize. This is baseball. This is Fenway Park in Boston, and unfortunately Boston is having a very bad day. It has 4 runs, and Tampa Bay has 13. The scorekeeper here cannot run out of runs. Okay, Tampa Bay can get 10 more runs, and he's going to be able to increase that to 24. Where do the runs come from? It's accounting. Can you run out of runs? No. Okay, the same idea can be applied to the government and its money. What is this? It's accounting. Can the government run out of dollars, which are electronic entries on a balance sheet? No, of course it can't run out. Okay, conclusions on affordability. A currency issuing government spends by crediting accounts, taxes by debiting, can always afford to spend more. There are issues. Inflation, yes, it's potentially a problem. Effect on exchange rates, yes, it can happen. Interest rate effects, well, not on the short-term rates because those are set by the Fed, but on market rates, there could be, and even on long-term government bonds, there could be an impact of more government spending. Sovereign floating currency gives more policy space. There's no default risk, can control the interest rates, at least on the short-term government debt, and can use policy to achieve full employment. Now, I have to be careful to make sure that you heard what I said and you didn't hear things I didn't say. Okay, I did say, sovereign government faces no financial constraints, cannot become insolvent in its own non-convertible currency. But it can only buy what is for sale in its own currency. For modern, wealthy, developed countries, this is not a problem. But if you go to, say, Kazakhstan, there are things that are for sale but not for tang. Okay? So in developing nations, there can be a difference between these two things. I did not say the government ought to buy everything for sale. Okay? You've got to leave resources for the pursuit of the private interest. Government is in charge of the public interest. There's a private interest out there too. You need to leave resources for them. The size of the government is mainly a political decision with economic effects. I did not say that deficits cannot be inflationary. Deficits that are too big can cause inflation. I did not say that deficits cannot affect exchange rates. Sovereign governments let currency float, and float means a currency can go up and down. So let me move on to the job guarantee, Minsky's theory here. It's an alternative to the NAIRU, that is the unemployment buffer stock to maintain price stability. It's an employment buffer stock program. It allows you to achieve full employment without setting off a wage price spiral. It's an unconditional offer of a public job at the minimum wage to anyone who wants to work. Okay, minimum wage whatever wage the program pays, by definition, is going to be the minimum wage. If the private sector wants to hire people out of this buffer stock of employed labor, it must offer a higher wage than what the program pays. So it, in effect, becomes the minimum wage. Minsky used to always say the legislated minimum wage is not an effective minimum wage, because if you can't get a job, your wage is zero. You can always get a job in this program, so that becomes the minimum wage. It maintains continuous full employment, defined as there is a job offer for anyone who wants to work, okay? When we have the title of this conference, full employment, what does full employment mean? The classical definition of what full employment is: there are more job vacancies than there are people seeking work. That's the definition of full employment, okay? Here, there's an unlimited supply of job vacancies, so by definition, there is full employment. The job guarantee provides a built-in inflation control mechanism, because as the economy starts growing, as the private sector starts heating up, private firms pull workers out of that program into the private sector, okay? That provides a pool of employable labor, but at the same time, it reduces government spending, because program spending on job creation by the government goes down, government spending goes down, as the private sector increases spending. In a recession, the reverse is true. People laid off in the private sector go into the jobs program, which increases government spending on wages in the program. So we can get full employment with greater price stability than the current system, which relies on an unemployed buffer stock. And later, if you want, I can talk more about why this is a higher quality anchor than the unemployed, who are losing their human capital skills and all the habits that are necessary to have a good workforce. Fluctuation of wage income and therefore consumption is reduced, because when you are laid off in the private sector, you don't go to unemployment status and possibly with some unemployment benefits, you go into employment. Additional benefits: it provides a framework to reduce hiring costs for private business, because the workers are demonstrating their willingness to work, their ability to work, the skills that they are obtaining on the job, which can be presented to any private employer that wants to hire them out of the program. Minsky argued that the goal of every job that is created in this program should be to provide on-the-job training, in addition to providing useful output from the work. It doesn't resolve all labor market problems, clearly, but it's better than the unemployment buffer stock option. So that's what it always should be compared to. It should not be compared to the ideal, which is everybody in a nice, high-paying private sector job, but it should be compared to the reality of an unemployment buffer stock. I have studied a partial job creation job guarantee program in Argentina called the Jefes program, and I imagine I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip over this, but I'd be glad to talk about the experience of this program. We learned a lot, both positive and negative, from this program that was created from planning stage to actual implementation in 4 months. In 4 months, they had 14% of the labor force working in this program. Now, obviously, you come up against some unexpected problems, but it was a highly successful program, and it did what it was designed to do, which is prepare a lot of workers for private sector work. A lot of the workers got pulled out of this program. There's been a recent report on a program in England that found the same thing. Yeah, I'll have to skip that. Okay. What about Euroland? The individual members are more like users of the currency rather than issuers of the currency. They are more like U.S. states rather than like the United States federal government. This is an argument we've been making from the very first time that monetary union was being developed, that this was going to be a problem. There is a limited capacity to fund government spending. You really can be subject to the whims of bond vigilantes as you deficit spend, okay, as we have found out. However, you still can implement a limited program, that is, a targeted program. You can choose to target the program, let's say, to unemployed youth. That will keep the program small and target a particularly serious problem, okay? In the case of Argentina, they actually had a targeted program. It was targeted to heads of households, poor heads of households with children. So that's a way to keep the program small. You can limit it to sort of a lottery. Everyone can register, but then there's a lottery on who will get in until you develop not only the financial capacity to employ more, but also the capacity to run the program. So you can have a gradual implementation of the program. Now, how could Euro nations move to a universal program that accepts, as Minsky said, you know, all workers who show up ready and willing to work? Well, one is you could go back to your own sovereign currency. This is very painful and costly in the short run. Eventually, you would get the fiscal capacity, but the route to that is probably highly undesirable. So a much better solution would be funding from the center. And this could come either from the ECB. Some proponents of a job guarantee program have advocated that the ECB actually provide the funding for the program. Clearly, it has the financial capacity to do this, but it probably does not have the political will, and it's probably not really in the purview of a central bank responsibility. So this is not my preferred choice, although it's even been proposed that the Fed in the U.S. Provide the finance for a job program in the United States. A much better way to run the program is to increase the fiscal capacity of the European Union, to make it more like Washington, with a budget that might be 10% of Euroland's GDP, distributed on a per capita basis, perhaps with a progressive bias so that lower income members get a greater amount of funding per capita than higher income members. This would give the fiscal capacity to operate a much larger job guarantee program than any nation is able to finance on their own. Some of the things that we've learned from the Argentina experience is that it's that you want to have the funding come from the central government, or in the case of the Euroland, from the center of Europe. But it's much better to decentralize the management of the program and to have projects proposed by communities. In Argentina, about 10% of the projects were proposed by the protesters who brought down 9 governments or something like that, because they have a better idea not only of who needs jobs, but they also have a good idea of what the community needs those workers to provide to the community. So you want to evaluate proposals that come forward and probably have several levels of evaluation before the projects are approved on the basis of the value to the community, the value to the participants. As Minsky said, training should be a goal of every job. the likelihood of successful implementation of the project, and the contribution to preparing workers for eventual non-program employment. The goal is that workers will move out of this program, that people will not remain in this program for their entire working lives, although the reality is that some people probably should. And so these should be good jobs that provide a feeling that the workers are contributing productively to their own community, which is very important, as we found interviewing the workers in Argentina. Minsky always said, you take workers as they are. You don't tell them, you go get trained and educated, then we will hire you. You take them as they are and then increase their training and education while they're working. You take them where they are. You don't tell them that they have to move, say, from rural areas to cities in order to get a job. Take them where they are. That could reduce migration in less developed countries, at least. And you create jobs in every community so that the voting population sees the benefits of these programs. This was one of the beauties of the New Deal. Americans all over the country saw the benefits of the New Deal jobs programs because their schools were built by the workers in the program, for example. Is the job guarantee applicable to developing countries? Yes, but again, it's probably going to have to be targeted. And it can be incorporated within a wider development strategy. I'll skip over that. Full employment and growth. Growth by itself is not an appropriate goal. Unfortunately, we moved away from a commitment to full employment on the belief that economic growth alone would be enough to take care of the unemployment problem. It is not enough. It doesn't create enough jobs, it promotes rising inequality, and it can be harmful for the environment, which of course is becoming a much greater concern everywhere. Full employment through the job guarantee promotes shared prosperity. It can be used to develop an environmentally sustainable development path, and it allows growth with price and currency stability. Okay, let me leave you with my favorite quote from Keynes. The conservative belief that there's some law of nature which prevents men from being employed, that it's rash to employ men. Now, we should make this men and women, of course, and that it's financially sound to maintain a tenth of the population in idleness. Today, it's even up to 50%, is crazily improbable, the sort of thing which no man could believe who had not had his head fuddled with nonsense for years and years. The Phillips curve notion that we need the unemployed to keep price inflation down is crazily improbable, as Keynes would say. Thanks.
Well, one certainly cannot cut a lecture in the middle when there's a job guarantee for Finland at stake. Thank you very much. In the next political debates or election campaigns, when somebody says, it's about economics, stupid, one has to say, it's about jobs, stupid, after this lecture. Before we have a coffee break now, I have two practical things. One is that we're not going to have a possibility to have questions from the audience at the panel debate, but if you have some specific question you would raise at the panel, there are some papers at the desk over there, so you can make the question on the paper and then we forward maybe them to the panel leader. So in that way you can affect the agenda. The other thing is that Ernst Tetterer referred to this independent annual growth survey. There are some 30 copies here around, so if you want to take a look at them, please do, and of course you can pick a copy with you if they are available, but the report is available online, as well as the new briefing paper by Kalevi Sorsa-säätiö. Jussi Ahokas and Lauri Holappa have written about the themes discussed today about the natural unemployment, from the natural unemployment to full employment. There are copies of this on the desk, and this is available on a net site of our foundation. So let's have a coffee break. We continue 20 after 4.